exhibit of art and labor off our walls that many of you have probably already seen over to this side of the building, and if you haven't seen it, to check it out before you leave. When I first asked Chris Mark to introduce Lou Martin, Chris' response was, "Why me? Why did you choose me? Why should I receive equal billing to? Why should I receive equal billing to Lou?" And I must confess that I didn't have a snappy comeback, but I did start thinking about how one might go about making a case for making a case for giving a good answer to his question. And here is very briefly what I came up with. Chris is a recipient of the Red Banner Award of the West Virginia Miners Museum. Pretty nice. Wow. Chris is also the recipient of Mother Jones' Hellraiser of the Year. Chris is a stalwart supporter of the Battle of Homestead Foundation. Chris is a stalwart supporter of Rivers of Steel.
Yes.
Chris is the recipient of a reward named for a guy by the name of Paul Volcker, who some of you are old enough to remember. Head of the Federal Reserve, no friend of organized labor, friend of working people, and yet regarded Chris as important enough to give their prize of the year too. So things were adding up for me, but still I could find no compelling reason why we should. Compelling answer to Chris's question, except that the answer was staring us right in the face like the proverbial elephant in the room. And that is, Chris saved people's lives.
Yes.
Speaking as a historian, historians by and large can't be credited with saving people's lives. Historians, for that matter, can't even be credited with making you a better person. Okay. But Chris saved people's lives. How many lives? Countless number of lives. That's how many lives. Are you serious? What countless mean in that or any other context? Answer: countless in the sense that we will never know how many lives Chris has saved. Okay, well, that's similar for me. Chris indeed deserves special billing, and we are so happy to have him here. And so without further ado, I introduce to you Chris Mark.
Well, I'm not sure how to follow that. I'm very, very proud and glad to be introducing my very good friend, Lou Martin. Lou's day job is as an associate professor of history at Chatham University. He's a widely known scholar at the intersection, we might say, of Appalachian studies and labor studies. He's published one book titled Smokestacks in the Hills, Rural Industrial Workers in West Virginia. And he has a second book on the way that's titled A Brief History of Appalachian Resistance. So I think from both of those titles, you can get an idea of where his research interests are. But I think from this audience's perspective, it's his career as an activist that's maybe even more appropriate. You started with the mountaintop removal, I think. Nothing had fired you up until that. That was about 15 years ago. And so Lou participated in the first reenactment of the Blair Mountain March, which was the mountaintop protest. And it was really quite an event in southern West Virginia. And that event, ultimately, some of the participants in that got together with the idea of building the Mine Wars Museum. And Lou was in on the ground floor of that. He was one of the founders of the museum. He served on the board for 10 years and was the president for a couple of years, and stepped away from the board, but is still very much involved in it. And of course, for those of you who may not be aware, the Mine Wars Museum has gone from just a kind of a twinkle in people's eye like Lou to being a real cultural force in southern West Virginia and Appalachia. And it's really one of the most exciting developments since I've been involved in that part of the world. It's now got 5 employees, and it's got its own building, the Cecil Roberts building down in Matewan, West Virginia. But its presence is felt throughout the area with a lot of the programs that they carry on. And a little bit closer to home, Lou's been one of the leaders of the organizing drive at Chatham University for the last couple of years, and he just can't stop wherever he is. That's what he's involved with. So again, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Lou.
Thank you so much here. So the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum has been a team effort, and everywhere I go I talk about it because it's one of my proudest accomplishments, being one of many people involved with starting this museum. And there's a list of people without whom the museum would not be what it is today, and Chris Mark is on that list. He's provided support at really critical times to help the museum expand its capacity, and I'm really glad to be on this team with Chris. And so it's an honor to have him introduce me tonight. I also want to thank Joe and Delsa for sharing their artwork with us and being the reason that we're gathered here tonight. I'd also like to thank Steffi and Joe for inviting me to give this talk, and I'd like to thank the folks of Rivers of Steel and the Battle of Homestead Foundation for tirelessly working to preserve labor history here in Homestead, around Pittsburgh, and the surrounding area. Much of the artwork around us includes a focus on immigrants. And it was impossible for Joe and Delsa and Steffi to ignore the irony that immigrants have played such a central role in building this nation, its industries, its infrastructure, and its labor movement. And at this very moment, immigrants are once again being demonized, just as they have been almost every generation in this nation's history. I've developed a course called Propaganda and History, and one of the goals of that course is to try to teach students about propaganda, how it works, what are the most common techniques used. And one of the techniques is called pinpointing the enemy. And according to the author Magda Szabo, she writes that propagandists often oversimplify complex problems by pointing out a single cause or a single enemy who can be blamed. For everything from unemployment to natural disasters, she says, pinpointing the enemy can help the propagandist achieve his or her agenda. Immigrants have been a convenient target for these propagandists. And I wish I could say that the people who have demonized them have always been the robber barons. But in fact, oftentimes people in the labor movement at different times have also demonized immigrants and fueled the fires of nativism. But there have also been moments when influential voices in the labor movement have promoted what we would today call the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And their goal was solidarity, presenting a united front to employers and capital and thwarting the divide and conquer tactics that they used. The goals were to get employers to sign and honor contracts and to gain a measure of control and stability in their lives. And so for these reasons, there have been moments where influential leaders have attempted to bring working people together across ethnic, religious, racial, linguistic lines. But before I get to that, I want to talk about the waves of immigrants over the U.S. history. For 120 years, immigrants, between 1820 and 1940, some 40 million people made their way to the U.S. And the first wave was following the Great Famine in Ireland. Excuse me. Irish were typically tenants on British-owned land, and about 2/3 of their farms were smaller than 15 acres. And that meant that they had to rely on potatoes, one of the few crops that would give them enough calories to survive. And so in 1846, when a blight struck the potatoes, parasites attacked the crops and prevented them from growing, which meant that more than 500,000 people over the next 3 years would starve to death. And more than 2 million would leave for other parts of Great Britain, Australia, and the United States. Irish immigrants crowded into black neighborhoods in New York City and Boston, and they came to be closely associated with African Americans in the minds of white native-born Americans. One of these immigrants was Ellen Nellie Holland, who grew up in Kenmare, Ireland. This was one of the places that was hardest hit by the plague. A visitor to the town wrote that at night you can hear the sounds of woe and wailing resounding in the street. In the morning, the visitor walked out to see that there were 9 corpses laying in the street. Nellie left her town and went to a workhouse nearby where she lived for 2 years, barely surviving on the meager rations available to them. She arrived in New York City where she became a washerwoman, and she married a common laborer, and they began to scrimp and save to try to get out of the 5 Points neighborhood. And in this image, this is Irish immigrants at the bank. It says depositors of the Immigrant Savings Bank withdrawing money to send to suffering relatives in the old country. And so this was one of the first waves of immigration, and it was also one of the first spikes of nativism. In this cartoon, the great fear of the period that Uncle Sam may be swallowed by foreigners. And so we see an Irish immigrant and a Chinese immigrant swallowing Uncle Sam whole. The United States at that time was almost entirely Protestant, and anti-Catholic sentiments ran high. Many believed that the Pope opposed democracy and liberty. Samuel Morse, who later popularized the telegraph, or commercialized it, wrote a book that was called Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States. And he argued that Catholics were just waiting for the Pope to give the order, and they would rise up and overthrow the U.S. government. And here we see a drawing that was depicting the Pope as a threat to essentially Uncle Sam. These ideas fueled hatred and fear of Irish immigrants. And hatred and fear are two of the strongest emotions. And the author of my propaganda textbook, Magadah Shawbo, says that the reason that propagandists invoke these strong emotions is to overwhelm critical thinking. And so when people are most afraid or hateful, they're most likely to act in the way that the propagandists want them to. And we can hear some of this fear and hatred in the statements about the Irish at the time. One said, "This is a race of utter savages." Another, "I am haunted by the human chimpanzees I saw along that 100 miles of horrible country." And another said, "They themselves are the missing link between the gorilla and the Negro." And see, these were some of the attitudes toward Irish immigrants. The American Party, or the Know-Nothings, were formed in 1843. And they grew rapidly in New York City and Boston. They had the goal of restricting government office to native-born Americans, restricting school teachers to Protestants, and having literacy tests to prevent illiterate Irish immigrants from registering to vote. They were unable to achieve a lot of their agenda, but they were able to win a lot of local elections, especially in areas with a lot of Irish immigrants. So this was one of the first waves. Another wave of immigration started in Shandong province of China in the 1870s. So this was an area of rapid expansion in coal mining, manufacturing, and shipping, which brought a great influx of peasants to the countryside. But after a flurry of activity, mechanization started to throw people out of work, and railroads meant that they no longer needed hand carts and hand-drawn barges. And so this added to the unemployment crisis. Famine struck in 1876, fueling a massive outmigration of some 9 million people over the next 3 years. Some headed north to Mongolia, but most would head to other parts of the Pacific world that were industrializing, and this included the western United States. Here is an image of the immigrants arriving in San Francisco, literally coming down the gangway. And this also sparked a wave of nativism, and Chinese immigrants faced extreme racism. When some factory owners hired them as strike breakers, it intensified the hatred of Chinese immigrants. And there were repeated attacks on Chinese communities. In 1871, a mob of some 500 people rampaged through LA's Chinatown, leaving 17 immigrants dead. Labor leaders in California never missed an opportunity to portray the new immigrants as a threat to the American standard of living. And they also portrayed them as subhuman, criminal, and uncivilized. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which restricted immigration from China. Here is a drawing of a different attack that killed 28 Chinese immigrants in Wyoming. So in addition to these dehumanizing portrayals, there were many attacks. The original treaty that had allowed Chinese immigrants to come to the United States did not extend naturalization rights to them in 1868. And so while they could come, they could never become citizens. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act negated that treaty and forbid further immigration. It was made permanent in 1902, and it was not revoked until after World War II. This is a image of titled Chinatown, taken in San Francisco in 1900, a more sympathetic portrait of the immigrants. This is Qingdao Port in Shandong today, continued to industrialize throughout the 19th and 20th century. So another wave would also come at that same time in the 1870s and 80s from Europe, as the eastern United States industrialized, entering what historians call the Second Industrial Revolution, which focused on coal, railroads, and steel. Industrialists looked to Europe for labor. Parts of Europe were experiencing industrialization and attracting migrants from the countryside, where there were population pressures on the land and mechanization of farming. And so a lot of these migrants made their way to mining and factory towns and port cities, and they wanted to make the highest wage they could in the shortest time period and maybe go back home to buy some land. So they began to compare notes about where they could earn cash wages, and America was one of those places. So the many Eastern and Southern Europeans migrated to the U.S. in this period, and many of them were striving for a better life, but just like other waves of immigrants, many native-born Americans viewed them as an indistinguishable mass of people from various countries. Like other immigrant waves before, they tended to follow what scholars call chain migration. A pioneer sets off to find a new opportunity and sends word back to their community about whether there is more opportunity to be had. And then if people follow, oftentimes with money the pioneer sends back, then they can help them find a new job and a place to live in their new community. Jews in Eastern Europe often lived in shtetls, which were villages that were primarily Jewish because of the hostility and anti-Semitism around them. These became very tight-knit communities where people spoke Yiddish, they shared a common religion, they intermarried, and they had many economic and social ties. When migrants left their homes in Poland or Lithuania or Russia, they used chain migration to reestablish their shtetl in cities like New York City. And the Lower East Side epitomized this, becoming home to 135,000 Jews from Eastern Europe. Immigrants clustered in major cities to the point where by 1920, the majority of people living in cities in the United States with 100,000 or more were either immigrants or the sons and daughters of immigrants. So that they made up 58% of the population of major American cities.
What date was that?
1920.
Wow.
So other Eastern and Southern Europeans, many of them Catholic, were recruited to the mines and mills of America. And I'm going to talk about Hungarian immigrants because my grandfather was one of them. My grandfather's here in the seat, and this is his parents, Lajos and Anna Marton. And he would be Lajos Marton, but my grandfather was Louis Martin, like my name. Lajos and Anna were ethnically Hungarian. They grew up in the village of Luvita in what's today northern Romania. And Lajos found work in a coal mine in Beach Bottom, West Virginia. By that time, the industrialists had come to see Eastern and Southern Europeans as good work for coal mines especially, because they would accept low wages for dangerous and difficult conditions. This is my grandfather at the Windsor Heights Coal Company town in the 1920s. So because as many as half of them planned on returning to Europe and would, they often didn't bother to learn their names or worry about safety and those other kinds of things. Obviously, industrialists also recruited Eastern and Southern Europeans to work in the steel industry. Andrew Carnegie was one of the drivers of innovation in the industry. Oh, and I forgot, I've got one more beach bottom picture. So this is a funeral of a coal miner in Beach Bottom, West Virginia, and these are my great-grandparents over there. So Andrew Carnegie spent a lot of money on a process known as the Bessemer process, which had the intention of replacing skilled Western European immigrants, English, Welsh, German immigrants, with cheaper Eastern and Southern European immigrants. So by de-skilling the work, Carnegie was providing a blueprint to other industrialists of how to weaken the union and how to undermine skilled craftsmen. Once again, to employers, there was no reason to learn the names or be too concerned about the dangerous and difficult working conditions they placed the immigrants in, which betrays a lack of respect that people like Carnegie had for them. I'm reminded of Herbert Gutman's classic article, Work Culture and Society in Industrializing America. He mentioned an Italian boy was hospitalized, and the staff discovered he only knew 2 words in English, boots and hurry. So that gives us an idea of what their conditions were like. And processes like the Bessemer converters, the foreman, instead of a 7-year apprenticeship, the foreman could simply pantomime shoveling the material into the skip hoist, and that was their training. So many skilled steel workers expressed nativist views about these Eastern and Southern European immigrants, seeing them as one of the reasons that their union was in decline. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers was formed after a strike. It was formed in 1876 after a strike in which employers recruited skilled black iron workers from the South. And so the white craft unions like the Sons of Vulcan and the Heaters, Rollers, and Roughers and others formed together in this amalgamated association, partly to present a unified front to the employer, but also to prevent African Americans from entering their industry. The 1876 Constitution of the Union said that it would be a union composed of all iron and steel workers who are competent workmen and of good character. But they obviously did not consider the Eastern and Southern Europeans to be of good character, because in practice, very few of them were ever admitted to this union. I just have a Lewis Hine photo here of Russian steel workers. In 1883, the president of the Amalgamated Association, John Jarrett, told a Senate committee that Hungarians, Poles, Italians, and Bohemians were men that really don't know the difference between light work and heavy work, or good and bad wages, and they lived where a decent man would die. And so, by the way, we can kind of hear in that description some of the origins of Joe Magurus, is how one of my sources says to pronounce that last name over there. Folklorists point out that Magurus in Slovak means donkey or ass. And some say that that's what it means in Hungarian too, but Google Translate would not confirm this. But this points to the idea that Joe only knew how to work hard and he had no understanding of when he was being exploited. We also, oh, I've got Joe here on a slide. So we also hear these same sentiments from the president of the American Federation of Labor, Samuel Gompers. He did not believe that new immigrants made good union members, saying that they were, quote, a heterogeneous stew of divergent and discordant customs, languages, institutions, and they are impossible to organize, end quote. So these immigrants faced increasingly hostile nativist attitudes in the 19-teens and 1920s. Many conservatives came to associate them with radicalism, and they considered them dangerous to American values and to capitalism. There was also intensifying religious bigotry at this time, anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism present in a lot of the discourse about the new immigrants. And there was also the pseudoscience that believed that Anglo-Saxons were the superior race in the world. The 1920s would witness the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, but the Klan flourished in the North, in Steel Cities, and it espoused anti-Semitism and anti-Catholic ideas as much as the white supremacist sentiments of the 19th century Klan. The nativism of this period culminated in the Immigration Act of 1924, which included restrictions on European immigration for the first time. It set quotas based on the 1890 census. And the obvious reason that they did that was to try to roll the clock back to when there were fewer Southern and Eastern European immigrants in the United States. Obviously, this allowed for more English, Irish, and German immigrants than Russians, Hungarians, or Italians going forward. The new European immigrants were still part of a divide and conquer strategy, and it started likely, the Battle of Homestead is one example. I wouldn't say that it started there, but this is one example of this divide and conquer strategy. Union officials in the Amalgamated Association struggled to overcome that strategy. They recognized what was happening, but they had trouble overcoming their own prejudices. And so when they finally did attempt to organize immigrants, they often did so in a half-hearted way, and they still tried to divide them between skilled and unskilled lodges, and they made no real effort to include them in decision-making or listen to them in any meaningful way. In 1919, the Amalgamated had one chance to try to rebuild the Union, but few of the organizers had made the kind of efforts that would have been necessary to truly include new immigrants. And the Great Steel Strike of 1919 ended in defeat. One union that was more successful, one union that was more successful was the United Mineworkers of America. They've been dealing with this divide and conquer strategy for decades at this point. And in 1904, Frank Warren wrote The Slav Invasion in the Mineworkers, which is kind of interesting because he was both laboring under the nativist prejudices against the new immigrants, but he was also recognizing that the United Mineworkers were pretty good at overcoming this. So he studied the role of recent immigrants in two strikes, one of them in 1900 and the other was the National Miners' Strike of 1902. In the introduction of his book, he says that the better citizen type of English-speaking mine worker was leaving the industry, and he said he feared that anthracite coal communities would not be able to assimilate the Slav races. However, he said, the one bright ray of hope was the United Mineworkers, because of its power of uniting mine workers of all nationalities, creeds, and tongues on the common ground of self-interest. In contrast, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, in contrast, when the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers was formed, they were steeped in the tradition of the old craft unions. When the United Mineworkers was formed, however, there were no craft unions in mining. They were also the result of bringing together two organizations into one, the Progressive Union of Miners and the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor had had a tradition of including African Americans and women in their ranks. And so this meant that the United Mineworkers was not built on distinctions between crafts or between skilled and unskilled workers. Its 1890 Constitution prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, religion, or national origin. Now, coal barons certainly tried the divide and conquer tactics. In southern West Virginia, mine operator Justice Collins wrote to advise his brother, who was then managing his own mines. He said to hire a judicious mixture of immigrants, African Americans, and native-born white miners. He said this would result in a workforce so divided that they would not be able to organize and present the owners with a united front. Instead, there were lots of instances where the miners, indeed, there were a lot of instances where they struggled to overcome difference, to cross ethnic, racial, religious, and linguistic divides. In the early years, the leadership of the United Mine Workers had only one African American, Richard L. Davis, whose job was primarily to smooth over the trouble between black and white miners in southern Ohio and West Virginia. There were no recent immigrants in national offices in the United Mine Workers. But the UMWA took a lot of steps to become more inclusive as an organization. The United Mine Workers Journal, for example, printed sections of the journal in different languages, and here I have the Italian section of the journal. The International Office also appointed organizers from among the immigrant communities, knowing they could speak the language, they shared a religion and other cultural traits with the people they were trying to organize. And when miners went on strike, strike aid was given equally to all members regardless of background. And then finally, being on the picket lines or in the tent colonies was a great unifying experience, as miserable as it might have been. And so this is depicted, by the way, in the movie Make One, that I'm sure many of you have seen, that the trials and tribulations of the tent colonies brought people together, whether they liked it or not. During the 1912-1913 Pink Creek and Cabin Creek strike, two of the men arrested and sent to the Moundsville State Penitentiary were Rocco Spinelli, an Italian immigrant, and Dan Chain, a black migrant. When some 10 to 15,000 miners took up arms and to help their comrades in Mingo County, West Virginia. About a quarter of them were African Americans, and along the way, they desegregated the mess hall of one of the company towns, refusing to abide by its Jim Crow policies. The first coal miner killed in the Battle of Blair Mountain was Eli Kemp, a black coal miner who was part of an interracial scouting party. At the time of the battle, a white miner summed up what the United Mine Workers meant to him. Frank Ball said, I call it, let's see here. Yeah, I call it a darn solid mass of different colors and tribes blended together, woven, bound, interlocked, tongued and grooved, and glued together in one body. This is a testament to the decades of attempts to unify people regardless of ethnic or racial identities. In Western Pennsylvania, there was a far larger percentage of immigrants in the mines than in Southern West Virginia. And in her 1995 book, The Miners of Windber, Millie Bike, who I'm sorry to say I did not get a chance to know, in her book she writes, ethnically diverse miners and their families overcame many obstacles to challenge the numerous autocratic structures they encountered in their daily lives. And on several occasions, they fought fierce battles for their right to join the United Mineworkers of America, the one democratic class-based alternative available to them. She went on to point out that over the decades, historians had neglected the foreign-born, especially Southern and European immigrants, she writes, and at other times unfairly characterized them as inherently poor union material. Obviously, her book effectively refuted those characterizations, the same characterizations that Samuel Gompers had spoken earlier, 6 decades earlier. In 1935, when John L. Lewis and several other labor leaders created the Congress of Industrial Organizations, this was in response to the American Federation of Labor and its failure to, in John Lewis's words, organize the unorganized, which would have meant organizing black and immigrant workers. Lewis had been president of the United Mineworkers for more than 15 years at that point. And one of the things that the UMWA did was to form the Steelworkers Organizing Committee with a $500,000 budget to hire organizers. I'm sure everybody's seen this picture from Aliquippa. This time, the Steelworkers Union would take on the United Mineworkers philosophy of ignoring craft divisions, of striving for racial and ethnic inclusivity. Like the United Mineworkers, the United Steelworkers tried to reach workers at this time by speaking and printing in various languages and trying to create a culture of unity around shared interests. Now, we know that these unions struggled to live up to these ideals, and at times we have to wonder whether it was more of the leadership's tactic of the moment or whether it was truly a deeply held philosophy. Nevertheless, the rise of the Steelworkers Union was another moment when the labor movement overcame ethnic, racial, religious, and linguistic divides. Needless to say, since the 1940s, there have been additional waves of immigration, starting with the arrival of Mexican immigrants as part of the federal government's Bracero program to recruit farm workers to help with food production during the war. And in 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act changed the laws. It eliminated the national origin quotas of the earlier law, and it based the new process primarily on two things: family relationships with U.S. citizens or specialized skills that were in need in the labor market. This law also created a new category for refugees seeking temporary asylum status. And so as a result, the waves of immigration have changed in the years since this law was passed. But in some ways, we're hearing echoes of the waves of nativism that we've heard before. And while fear and hatred of immigrants has a long history in America, in recent years, an increasing number of propagandists have fueled these strong feelings and tried to capitalize on them. And I'm going to return to my quote about pinpointing the enemy. So propaganda is different from ordinary rhetoric in a few ways. One is that it has an agenda. The propagandist wants the audience member to take a specific action, whether that's voting for a certain candidate, donating to a campaign, supporting some policy, overlooking corruption, or forming an angry mob. In addition to having an agenda, propagandists rely on scientific research to see what messaging is the most effective. In 2022, the New York Times reporter Nicholas Confessor wrote a detailed profile of Fox News personality Tucker Carlson and his rise to prominence in the media landscape. And one thing that helped Carlson was his use of minute-by-minute ratings. Confessor writes that these ratings allowed his producers, quote, to scrutinize an audience's real-time ebb and flow. And when they began to study the numbers in 2017, Confessor writes, the show began devoting more and more airtime to immigration and to what its host depicted as the looming catastrophe of demographic change. In other words, these stories got the greatest engagement from his audience. And so Carlson began to share what to some seemed like random stories that his staff members dug up from the internet. One was about a new line of hijabs from Macy's. Another was about a town in Pennsylvania who Carlson falsely claimed had streets covered in feces because of the arrival of refugees, likening them to animals. Carlson is now one of many media figures peddling these tropes that are centuries old. Immigrants are portrayed as a threat to American standards of living, to the safety and decency of American communities, and a threat to democracy itself. But today's propagandists can now precisely measure how effective their messaging is at stoking the fear and the hatred in their audiences. And in some ways, the agenda for today's nativists is similar to those of the 19th and 20th centuries, to marginalize parts of society, to divide and conquer the working class, and to gain and maintain power. Much like earlier generations, these nativists who declare themselves to be the protectors of American values and democracy are in fact the biggest threat to American values and democracy. Thank you.
Well, I think I'm the discussant because I think we're losing Chris right now.
Okay.
We knew that might happen. If you want to,
Is this the thank you part or?
this is this
Okay.
is the Q&A part. So I want to urge anybody who has a question for Lou to raise your hand and ask it. Yes, Mel, and then.
Well, my wife's uncle was part of that Alan Cooper committee. Who was shot as a fairly young person. They called him Blackie because he was Southern Italy and was dark-skinned, right? And he was a chief steward. He was a head griever there for quite some time. But I take exception, I think, to your claim about the USW resolving differences. It took until 1972 or 74 when the consent decree came along. Until then, the Steelworkers Union participated in discrimination against black workers and women workers, right? So I don't. You had said in there that they began to, that not only began, but they melded together and worked together and addressed those differences. I don't think they did.
Yeah, I know that I maybe said it quickly, but I also said that at times we had to wonder whether these were tactics of the moment of 1936 and 7,
Okay.
or whether they were truly deeply held philosophies. And what I was alluding to was the fact that once they had contracts, even contracts with non-discrimination clauses, you know, as you mentioned, it would take another 3 decades before those consent decrees made them actually honor those clauses. Yes. And even then,
Yes.
some people, you know, in Little Steel and other places that weren't part of the consent decree, there continued to be all kinds of discrimination. And even the consent decree, I think that this is what you might be nodding to, the consent decree itself did not eliminate the divides and discrimination.
Thank you.
And just to add, actually, women had not filed, weren't part of the discriminatory piece, but we were part of the settlement.
Right, right.
Because it was blacks and people with Spanish surnames who signed the lawsuits under the Civil Rights Act, 64.
The slide about pinpointing kind of strikes home. But don't the enemies also pinpoint back?
In what way?
In other words, one side will be pinpointed, and they'll look up and go, huh, we can do this too. And I think that's going on right now, and it's very difficult to find any good in any side.
Yeah, I'll say that, you know, historically, the people who have been on the receiving end of the pinpointing have not had the same access to media that the propagandists have.
Correct.
Or resources. You know, more today with social media, I agree that there's a lot of finger pointing and a lot of, I think pinpointing the enemy going every which way. Yeah, and so becoming more increasingly polarized, yeah.
Yep.
And Joe's got a question. Or a
Well,
comment.
what strikes me is that our side doesn't give tit for tat with the vigor and militancy that the other side does. For example, how many liberal academics, starting for the likes of us, have pointed out that the nativists, if they're so damned sure that our version of history is all wrong from beginning to end, write your own goddamn history. Well, where is your own history? You don't write your own history. Instead, you turn to fakers and troublemakers and media freaks for techniques for pinpointing techniques. Okay, that's one thing I want to say. The other thing I want to say is that there's an old French expression. Hypocrisy is how Hypocrisy is the homage that vice pays to virtue. Okay, well, I forgot to bring with me a 1942 edition of the United Steelworkers Constitution, which which says Article 1, not Article 72, but Article 1 of the Constitution says that the Steelworkers Union is open to people of all colors, beliefs, and creeds. Okay, is this a matter of open hypocrisy on the steelworkers, the rank and file, and leadership alike? That's something that's both worrisome but so important that we have to deal with it and face that problem squarely. Okay. And finally, I have a West Virginia question. Blanco Glass, okay, had on its wall a framed letter from Eugene B. Debs. Okay, what's the story? What's the story on that? And to your knowledge, they've been wanting for years to learn more about it.
Yeah, I'll start with that last question. A great historian from the past, Fred Barkey, who was a University of Pittsburgh PhD in history, wrote about the Socialist Party in West Virginia, and Deb's made multiple trips through West Virginia, and Barkey found that glass workers were among the biggest supporters, and these were skilled craftsmen, but they had a particular history of socialism dating back to Belgium before they immigrated to the United States. And I'll have to revisit his book to see the details. I don't know if Blinko was one of those, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was. Your point's well taken that the nativists don't write history with the same rigor, I think, that what we try to write our histories. And it's because they never would be able to. You know, the propagandist is relying on manipulating and falsehoods, as well as selective use of information and all sorts of things that would never stand up to scrutiny if people could check the emotion and critically think about what they're seeing or reading. And then the hypocrisy. Yeah, we've talked a little bit already about the United Steelworkers, and it seems like it was an expedience of the 1930s to get everybody in the door and get that first contract, and then some of the old prejudices returned, especially when there was power and resources at stake.
Go ahead, and then you.
To play off a little bit of what Jack was saying in terms of pinpointing the enemy and really just reducing anything to a single cause, you know? And implicit in that, of course, is like it would be better to expand the net, and that just makes for a more realistic image and just a more rich story anyway. And that's great when you have the time to do it, like the bandwidth to do it, like we have now, like, you know, a whole hour to discuss and really make a nice point. But the reality that I find being able to discuss history and stuff like this in life is you're lucky if you have 10 minutes, you know, maybe 20 if you hit the jackpot. And then also a lot of discussion, of course, happens online, and that's intrinsically like sort of bite-sized. But really, I find myself in many moments where it's like I'm in a casual conversation and then something gets brought up, it fires a synapse in my head, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can bring this up, and I got 2 or 3 minutes to say something, and without just like dominating the conversation. And inherent in that, now, number one, I do have a point to make, because I don't have a lot of time. I am going to cherry pick like the most poignant thing, and it kind of brings to mind everything you were saying, and I often have a hard time squaring the ethics of all that, you know, for obvious reasons. So I guess, I don't know, I'm curious about your take on how that, on that scenario, and how it kind of boils down to like everyday life and this sort of thing.
Yeah, so I think in a debate or even an online debate, it's one thing for you to express your beliefs and to try to use evidence to make your point. But it's a totally different thing with the pinpointing the enemy or other propagandists who are large organizations like Carlson on Fox News, who has a whole staff that can study what is going to make you or their audience member, whoever it is, respond the most. And so I don't think, and I think part of your question, so I think that the propaganda and the creators of propaganda are different from what you're describing as like daily interactions. What I think your question is what do we do in those 2 minutes that we have to talk to somebody? And one of the things that I believe, and I don't, if I had the answer, I would have started with that. But one of the things I believe is that by exposing the common techniques of propaganda, you might have a better chance of somebody picking up on it and seeing that they've been manipulated. And that's one of the reasons I'm teaching this class. And the last assignment is to have students try to create a social media lesson for their peers to teach them the common techniques of propaganda. And I'm waiting for like the Mozart of memes or whatever to take my class and to create something that helps to like illuminate this and how it works to other people. Hasn't happened yet, but I'm waiting.
Oh, yes, I wanted to say something quickly about William Silvis, who was a labor leader in the 1860s, before the Civil War, who pulled together the Molders International Union, that is the folks that made molds of all kinds of things in the incipient iron and steel industry, and especially around, of course, the Civil War production. War is always in sight, more production, as we know. And that's why we have a permanent arms economy, but that's another discussion. But so William Silvis was an important anti-racist leader of that time. Unfortunately, he died during the Civil War, and his leadership skills and message were carried somewhat through the union historically, the Molders Union. The Molders Union went through several different mergers, as industrial unions tend to. As industry changes, the unions change, and then they have to morph. And now they became the glass molders and something else union, and now have merged with the steel workers. Now I had the privilege of organizing a history museum down at the Steelworkers International, and got to delve a little bit into Silvis and his legacy. There were several divisions within the glass and molders and unions, and some of them were based on discriminatory practices. In this case, generally against the newly liberated former slaves of the South who were, getting industrial jobs. So his legacy was hard fought, but it didn't always win in those contexts. So I thought Silvis he was one of those folks who, if only he had survived, he hadn't gone, I think he died at 48 or something forward, he was someone who really had that, and he wrote about how important it was not to divide the working class. And he's writing before Marx, right? He's writing about class issues in the 1840s. So I go on that because I could. Go ahead.
It's totally fine if you've already kind of answered it, but this was a great presentation, and just thinking about how history has seemingly continued to repeat itself via propaganda, and how there's always some group in society that appears to be being put down. Do you have any thoughts or ideas on how going forward we can break this cycle? And I know that's not something you could really fully answer, because then you'd be a billionaire, but just having studied this, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so once again, teaching the common techniques of propaganda, I do think is part of the answer. Humanizing the enemy, could be the opposite strategy to pinpointing the enemy. And so having the stories that treat people as a whole person, and talk about their struggles and their joy and their customs in ways that can try to break through that pinpointing the enemy. And then lastly, I'll say, following on what Steffi was just saying, institutions like the United Steelworkers or the labor movement generally have been, like this Frank Warren said in 1904, one of the rays of hope. And if the labor movement can organize people around principles that, and I think this is one of the things you see in Minneapolis, is this strong labor history and strong organizing tradition, and bringing people together over a long period of time, across difference, is why it's a different kind of place. And then you look at the places where there aren't unions, and you see the opposite. You see far more ability to divide and conquer, pinpoint the enemy, and all of those things. Karen, I think you have.
Yeah, Lou, great to see you. And it's always helpful to me to try to make sense of what the craziness of today through the lens of history. So I really appreciate what you shared today. But like everybody else, I'm wondering, what's the answer? And probably like everybody else, I have a couple people in my family who unfortunately, facts don't work. The kind of conversation that I think would make sense to help, it doesn't work, and I find that very frustrating. But what really shocked me, and this is really new to me because I don't pay attention to football, and I never knew who Bad Bunny was, but there was all that flurry, and I watched the halftime show, and I'm so invigorated by what this young man has brought. And I know it's not exactly labor history, but he's breaking through the othering. And he's showing a different way of doing it that might actually impact younger people, or maybe even older people, because it really impacted me. So I just wondered if your class had a chance to talk about that and what you think about. I don't know exactly what my question is, but I was just very moved by that experience and by all of the dialogue that's going on now, because I watch a lot of YouTube videos and the education about Puerto Rico and what all the symbolism meant, and it's like, oh my God, who would have thought that this 31-year-old guy from Puerto Rico could stir up? Anyways, if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, I do. One of the ways that propaganda is most effective, it has to be constant. People can't just be exposed to the message one time. They have to be repeatedly immersed in that messaging for it to be effective. And obviously, censorship of the media is, one way to do that. But historically in the United States, the native-born white Americans who have had control of our media have effectively locked out a lot of people of color, and now we see Bad Bunny and other people being able to break through, and it's a wonderful thing. However, I also want to say that I went home to watch the Super Bowl at a party where the guy, when halftime came, he turned on the YouTube Kid Rock, whatever, and so that's an example of they blocked out the messaging, and so I think that I told my wife we continue to go down two separate paths of two realities.
Right, but 6 million people watched Turning Point, and 136 million watched Bad Bunny. So,
Exactly right.
yay.
Yeah, that is good. And I'll also just say for your family members, one of the reasons that propaganda like this works is because it serves an emotional purpose. There's some need that the person has, and that could be because of some loss of employment or things aren't turning out the way they wanted. There's something. It's not just the fact that they've been manipulated. There's usually some reason that they're vulnerable to it, and sometimes maybe arguing with them is not as effective as and kind of belittling their ideas and whatever might not be as effective as trying to address some of those root causes. I'm not a psychologist or a therapist or whatever, but I do think that for instance, if we had more meaningful employment and paths of hope and stuff like that we would see fewer of these people showing up on January 6th and stuff like that.
Go ahead, Carolyn, and then John.
Has anybody ever tried to just take this on, like, head on? Like, do you realize that this is the old divide and conquer tactic that's being, like, played on you? I mean, just kind of like, it wasn't the immigrants that outsourced your jobs. It wasn't, it wasn't you know, these other forces that kept your wages down. It was other people, and they're running a game on you, and try. I mean, is there any value in just educating people that way? Like just kind of saying, this is something that rich people have been doing, the rich and powerful have been doing since time immemorial, and stop falling for it.
Yeah, and I bet you John could speak to this, because I bet as a union organizer, he was able to gain people's trust in a way that Professor Liu never. And so I think that, you know, people are going to reject outright what I have to say in most instances, but it's those one-on-one conversations after you get to know somebody and they really need help that I think that, and if there's also an answer, like join the union, that might be effective. I'll also say there's an organization called More Perfect Union. It's a media organization that I really like, and local guy from Wheeling, West Virginia is one of their kind of star reporters, and he's doing a lot of this kind of work, having conversations with people who are Trump supporters and stuff like that.
Well, we do have Peter in the room, and John as well, a number of other folks who've been working for unions that have made anti-racist propaganda their part of the centerpiece. I don't know if, Peter, you want to say something.
I do want to say something. Unfortunately, not that, which would be a great topic. But for obvious reasons, on my mind lately has been the Latimer Massacre and the Moorwood Massacre, when foreign-born workers were shot down by respectable forces of law and order. So the comparisons make sense. The question is, what's changed? What's different from the 1890s?
What's different? I think that, you know, having video footage of the shootings, you know, that's been really powerful and effective at kind of, you know, back then I think that whoever ran the newspaper had the last word.
Yeah.
And so that's not as much the case today. I would also say that with, you know, race, I would say, is different. And there was this racist idea of Anglo-Saxonism that labeled the Eastern Europeans, you know, I forget what their racial category was, but at any rate, I don't think it's nearly evokes the kind of racist hatred that, for instance, one thing that Tucker Carlson has seized on is Somalis, because they are dark-skinned, Muslim, and you know, that they've really seized on people with darker skin because that seems to evoke greater hatred. And so I would guess that these Eastern and Southern Europeans weren't treated as badly as people, for instance, African Americans in the South, or Chinese immigrants at the same time. Those would be a couple of thoughts. I think John
John,
has gotten in the queue.
With our organization, Battle of Homestead, we talk about a people's history, and I think we're constantly trying to refine what that means and how we do it. And a couple of things that have popped up to me listening to your really impressive speech tonight, and that's number one, the contributions that those unskilled people have made, their value to society as workers, the Chinese who built the railroads and the hunkies that poured the steel and died in the mill, and their contribution to society, and that it has a value and it has an economic value, and the bosses know it. And I think we have to celebrate that work itself. That through work people get the dignity to actually learn how to be part of a new society if they come into a new environment. That's one thing. The other thing is the tremendous richness of the different ethnic heritages that, you know, the people love to talk about the music and the dances, the menus that they had, the food that they've had. I mean, look at all the churches that were in Homestead, and every single one of them was a cultural center of different ethnic groups. And there's fantastic richness in those two emphasis. And the third is the clash of religions. And there's a lot of religions that are universal as well, and that respect the other religions. And there's a lot of tradition in our religions that humanizes your neighbor. I'm happy about the Fighting Lutherans in Minneapolis, to tell you the truth. But that certainly, and certainly the contributions of slaves, and the contributions were that they built America, you know, and the comparison of slavery to wage slavery is important, and people, I think, can begin to think, yeah, the rich were really getting rich, and the people that did the work weren't getting the full value of their work. So I'd like to think we can tell stories that emphasize some of those themes to try to push through the memes that appear there. And I think that's why the cultural centers like the Mineworkers or the Mine Wars Museum, like the center that we would love to have here of history and future of work, and the tremendous educational opportunities there are to begin to tell that people's history in a meaningful way to people. People love to talk about their ethnic history, I think, now, and we should be proud of that, and they are proud of it. So it's not just the fact that there's propaganda, it's that I think if we tell the truth, and if we humanize, and if we celebrate the work and the value of dignity in work, and we humanize the worker and the rights of people, the last thing is there's a horrible propaganda that springs up around war and nation fighting nation, worker fighting worker, and dehumanizing the other side. And to me, it's a damn shame that it takes a war to build up the industrial base that eventually can make life a little bit better in terms of the ability for people to get an education, to have a job, and all the rest of it. But can we do that without war? You know, all those things come up.
And let me just comment very briefly on the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum is partnering with the Coalfield Development Corporation on a building across the street from the museum that's falling apart. They're rebuilding the structure of it, and in the base, or in the first floor, they're going to have a training center for carpentry, I think, carpenter training center. The upstairs apartment belonged to Sid Hatfield, and if you know Lou Mate-1, he was the chief of police of Mate-1 and fought against the Baldwin Felts agents of the coal companies. We've got plans to turn that into a center on migrants and immigrants, and focusing not just on the migrants and immigrants of the mine wars period, but even subsequent years up to and including the people that own the Mexican restaurant next door. And so that's our attempt to do a little bit of what you were talking about. So we've got time for one more.
Just a,
Very quick.
mine's a joke.
Okay, make it funny.
Okay. Well, you mentioned Tucker Carlson and the Mollies. Now, this is a generational thing. When you say Mollies, I think of the Irish coal miners in Schuylkill County who fought with the mine owners and the Pinkertons.
Yeah.
Nobody laughed.
That's a good one.
But that's it.
All right, on that note. Anyway, I want to just thank you, Lou, for your... we were going to initially have two closing things, one the end of last month and then at the end of this month, but we've had to smoosh them together given the snowstorm and other things that have happened. But what I want to do now is to bring forward Emily Eckel and Joe Nagy, if you would like to come up with me, and my friend Jennifer Rempel. And really, what I'd like to do is to take a moment to thank and the artists who have produced this work that we have in this show, and to thank Joe and Delsa for allowing me to rifle through their artwork on the walls, under the beds, and in the closets, and to put this show together, and to also point out some of the work, like Fran Gialamas, who is right here, has been here. Her work is part of the Rivers of Steel collection. Some marvelous artists. Here we have Roses. You know, the painting is just a fabulous painting about called We Worked in the Mill, and she has other work. We have Bob Qualters represented, a marvelous artist in Western Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, in his 90s, he's not leaving the house much, and but his work is here, and his work is also in the show, not just the big piece that you see when you get off the elevator here, but he was gracious enough to do colorizing for our film, The River Ran Red, of images that we got out of Harper's Weekly and Frank Leslie's Weekly, and sort of make those images come alive with the kind of color that only Bob can do. And then there's, I have to get my list out. Don't want to forget. Connie Merriman was here earlier. If you go around the corner there, right behind Pauline there's a big painting on the wall there of a steel worker. Connie painted it many years ago. She's a very prolific artist still, and a very celebrated artist of Western Pennsylvania, arts, culture, environment, and whatnot. And we had Emily, who's I'm going to give a chance to talk. There's many unknown artists in this whole show. Some of whom we remember only, like Dabbs. Dabbs was a photographer in 1892 who took the iconic photo of the burning barges from across the river, which became then a Harper's Weekly image, and that we have on the wall thanks to Joe and Delsa's collection. And then we have, let me see if I've forgotten somebody. We have the new generation of artists who are doing work now. And I just want to introduce Jennifer, who did, Jennifer Rempel. You can just stand a second. Jennifer has been painting portraits of women fighters, and her work has been celebrated a lot in the labor magazines of Pittsburgh, and the work that we've been doing with the Battle of Homestead. Mother Jones and Fanny Sellens and her work. So and Pauline and I have had many discussions about how the artists produce the work, and somehow then the discussion is about something else, and never about the artists and the producers. And I think it's important to mention them. And then Chris McGinnis, his work is there on that easel. He's an artist who works here at Rivers of Steel, and is again a new generation, a member of a new generation of artists who are doing that kind of work and responding to the history and the energy of the steel industry. And on the table there, you'll see that we have posters of a sort of a cartoon history of the Homestead strike that Bill Young, our good friend Bill Young, produced, and he gave us the last of his posters, and would like anyone here who would like a copy to take one. If you want to put a donation in for Battle of Homestead, we'd appreciate it, but you don't need to. And the remainder, I think, we'll hope that Rivers of Steel will sell in their bookstore. So Emily Eckel is one of the artists, along with Joe Navy, who produced the iconic hot dog strike. And maybe you want to talk about that and maybe your work.
Okay, I'll keep this brief. The hot dog poster was done to support a strike at the original hot dog shop. And this was during the Vietnam War era. And a small group of us had a silkscreen collective, and we produced posters protesting the war, and occasionally we supported other causes such as the hot dog strike. And then we would go around town and we would glue them up. We were inspired by the French student revolt posters, where they produced silk screens to communicate with other people because there was no internet. And we liked the style of the imagery, and the French student revolt poster style is somewhat mimicked in what we did for the hot dog shop. I did the image, and Joseph did the words. That was a pretty typical arrangement in our little collective. I thought a lot about what kind of image to use, and I realized that the raised fist was a symbol that was used by many protests. Civil rights, the Great Boycott, the feminists used the raised. Yeah. And so I kind of saw it as a unifying symbol. And being up in the air, no one's about to get hit. So that's why there's a fist up in the air holding the hot dog. I'm going to say a few things following up on the discussion tonight. And one is that in addition to stories about workers giving dignity to people, imagery does too. And that it's really important to document in whatever media you want to use. And I urge people to produce and to support artists who are documenting the things that are happening today, who have a point of view that gives everyone some dignity and equal rights. So buy some art, hang it on your wall, buy the wearables. get yourself a t-shirt supporting the folks in Minneapolis or whatever, but whatever form it takes that works for you, support the artist. Try to acquire the art as close to the producing artist as possible. Try to avoid the mass-produced rip-offs. The last thing I want to say is that I have a bunch of silk screens and squeegees and other equipment to produce silkscreen prints that I would like to offer to the younger generation. I would like to pass it on so that it can continue to be used. So please see me when we're done talking and we'll make a connection. I did bring 4 pieces of recent art with me that I can pull out and show you. I have a digital photo collage about family separation. I have a woodcut print I did after the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue, and that was a fundraising print. And then I have 2 drawings of people at my favorite diner. One of them is a laborer, the waitress. And thank you for putting this together. It's a hell of a lot of work to curate and hang a show. It truly is, so we should give her a big hand.
Well, I think that concludes it. I'm going to clean off some space for Emily to put her work. We have a little table back there,
Okay.
we can make that happen. And I just want to thank all of you for coming to our final forum here. We've tried to use this a little bit to bring people together. And also, I just want to thank Joe and Delsa for allowing me It's a great privilege to work with people who are like yourselves.